Hey all, welcome back to my channel, and today you're tuning into another commentary with Clyve piece, this time focusing on the cast of Mortal Kombat 9. Everyone loves different fighting games for different reasons, but what draws you to a particular franchise is usually the characters that are playable on the roster. In this three-part series, I'll be exploring the rosters of Mortal Kombat 9, Mortal Kombat X, and Mortal Kombat 11. Now, MK is one of my favorite franchises. I grew up with it, so this is an easy sell for me, right? At the end of this discussion, I will rate the cast on a scale from 1 to 10. And I use three main categories to help me come to that decision. The first being the background. What was going on with the franchise at that point in time when the game was released? This can also extend beyond the franchise, and we can be talking about the gaming landscape or what's going on in the fighting game community, or the FGC as it's known as. I'll also be talking about the roster, looking at the characters that were actually included as playable characters. This includes those characters that were available at launch as well as post-launch characters known as DLC. And finally, I'll just be giving me pros and cons of the roster. So before I jump into talking about the roster in MK9, I just want to pause for a bit and remind you guys to please like, comment, and subscribe. Share this video. Follow me on all platforms. The links will be in the description of this video. So without further ado, let's get started. Mortal Kombat 9 was released on April 19th, 2011. And before I start talking about Mortal Kombat 9's roster, I think it's important to touch on those MK games that came right before it. Starting with Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance, which was released in November of 2002. It was, the second in a string of 3D era fighting games. And this particular game introduced 8 brand new characters to us. This is where we got Bo' Rai Cho, Draman, Frost, Suhao, Kenshi, Li Mei, Mavado, Nitara, as well as Morlock. This was the first game that notably did not feature Liu Kang as a playable character. If you recall, he was actually murdered by the Deadly Alliance known as Shang Tsung and Quan Chi, so he was not playable on the roster, which was a big deal because at that point in time, Liu Kang was the franchise's main hero. So it almost seemed unfathomable that he would not be playable in a game, but he wasn't in that one. Then came Mortal Kombat Deception, which was released in October of 2004. What notably stood out about this game, number one, being the Conquest mode. Essentially, this functioned as that game's story mode, starring Shujinko, who journeyed throughout the different realms on his quest to stop the Dragon King. Alongside Shujinko, this game introduced us to 7 more new characters, which included Ashura, Dairu, Darius, Havoc, Hataru, Kira, Cobra, and it also notably brought back fan favorites like Baraka, Jade, Sindel, Melina. It brought back Liu Kang, although as a zombie. And this is important because the majority of this group had not been seen since Mortal Kombat 2 to 3. Which was an entire different generation. So these characters had been MIA for quite some time. Returning from Deadly Alliance, the only 3 new characters that came over from those batch of 8 that was introduced was Bo' Rai Cho, Kenshi, and Li Mei. The next game came Mortal Kombat Armageddon. Now, honestly, I could spend an entire video just talking about Mortal Kombat Armageddon, but for the purposes of discussing the roster of MK9, all you need to know about Mortal Kombat Armageddon is this. It was the largest MK roster to date. It included every playable character from the franchise's history. The only 2 new characters that we got in that game were Taven and Dagon. Now, we were also given Serena to play as in that game, but technically that wasn't her first time on a roster. As a playable character, she was playable in Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance for the Game Boy Advance. Yes, Game Boy Advance, you remember that? And the last game I want to touch on is Mortal Kombat vs. DC Universe, which came out in November of 2008. This roster only included 11 characters from the MK universe, as well as 11 from the DC universe, which was the whole shtick, right? And this is largely viewed as a one-off game because it never really fully felt like a realized Mortal Kombat game. And quite honestly, in my opinion, it sort of laid the foundation for how Netherealm games were going to play. So it might not have been good for the Mortal Kombat franchise, but it was good in sort of pointing them in the right direction with how their games should play. And that's not a lot of people agree with that, but there were a lot of similarities between how MK versus DC played and MK9 played. So essentially, MK versus DC walked so MK9 could run. It's also important to point out that the period in which MK9 was released, that's when we saw the resurgence of fighting games. It had been quite some time since all of the mainstream fighting games had released any playable version of their game, and this was kicked off by Street Fighter 4, which was released in July of 2008. And once that game came out, all of the studios went back to releasing their own fighting games. So now that we got the background out of the way, let's talk about the roster of MK9. It reintroduced the cast of MK1 to 3 to a brand new generation of gamers. And this is important because not only was it new players getting familiarized with these classic characters, it was also a new generation of technology. We're talking about jumping from the PlayStation 2 to the PlayStation 3, which allows the developers to really do a lot more things that they could not accomplish in the prior generation. All your fan favorites are here. Everyone from Cyborg and from Cyrax to Sector, as well as all of the female ninjas. And that's a perfect example to highlight. In Deadly Alliance, Kitana was a playable character, but in Deception, she was not. Whereas Melina had the opposite. She was not playable in Deadly Alliance, but she was brought back in Deception. And then she was brought back in Deception alongside Jade. Well, MK9 brought all three women together, which is really important because they're very popular. They're some of the more popular characters in MK's history as the female ninjas. So to see all of them back together on the roster was really important. And the same goes for the MK ninjas as well. You expect Scorpion, you expect Sub-Zero, but you're never sure if you're going to get Reptile or Ermac. You're never sure if you're going to get Noob Saibot or Smoke. All of those characters were here for MK9 and were playable when the game launched, which is a good thing to see. MK9 also reimagined the story, which ended up setting the majority of the fan favorites down a different path. So what do I mean by that? Cyrax and Sector. Now, growing up, I had only known them to be machines or cyborgs, but MK9 actually showed them as ninjas prior to them becoming cyberized. MK9 also introduced one new character, Cyber Sub-Zero, and again, this is important because we had never had a Cyber Sub-Zero before. In the original storyline, it wasn't Sub-Zero that underwent the Lin Kuei cyber initiative, it was Smoke. Well, in this game, Sub-Zero ended up going through it. We had one returning character in Quan Chi. He's been a classic villain for quite some time. Even though he wasn't part of the classic MK1 to 3 group, it made sense to bring him back in MK9 alongside another classic villain, Shang Tsung. If you recall, they were dubbed the Deadly Alliance that reigned hell and terror and killed Liu Kang in Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance. As for the guest character, if you were lucky enough to play this on the PlayStation 3, you got Kratos from God of War. And I mean, if there were any perfect character to be a guest character in a Mortal Kombat game, it would be Kratos. Enough said about that. Unfortunately, the Xbox version did not have a guest character exclusive to Xbox. That's just unfortunate. And then the DLC, which gave us a summer of combat. Throughout the summer, the developers released DLC all throughout. In June of 2011, we got Scarlet. Later on in June, in July, we got Kenshi and Rain. And in August, we got Freddy Krueger as a DLC character. Freddy Krueger was available for both the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360 versions of the game. So you might be asking now, what is my rating for MK9? Well, I give it a solid 8. You might wonder why. Well, the pros of MK9 is, number one, it reintroduced the franchise's most recognizable characters to a new generation of players. I recall vividly when the game was announced and they were hyping it up with all the trailers, when I would go online to the different forums or leaderboards and seeing the discussion of why people were excited about this game, it always had to do with the fact that Netherealm was bringing back all of the classic characters that some of the older players had grown up playing inside of their local arcades. So to bring back those characters that built the foundation that is Mortal Kombat, to bring them back and to reimagine their storyline, I thought that was a great thing, especially when it's the first game on a new generation. Anytime you have a new system, you have new players, you have new technology, it was the right call. And now personally that I'm the older player, I yearn to see those 3D era characters return, and I'm still yearning. But I understand the feeling of being excited to see those characters you grew up with making a return, because for a while, like I discussed earlier, for a while they were not mainstays on the roster. So with MK9, they were coming back, and they were coming back together, which was really good. Another pro was the DLC. It was just enough to sort of keep us going when they were released, but more importantly, it set the foundation for how DLC would be handled in future Mortal Kombat games, as well as Netherealm's other fighting game, Injustice. It still follows the same formula. We got Scarlet, who became fully realized. If you recall, Scarlet started off as a rumor. There was a rumor that in MK2, Katana could turn red for whatever reason, and she was dubbed Scarlet. So in MK9, they gave us Scarlet. They actually created a character around this rumor. And that's how a lot of their classic characters started. That's how we got Ermac. And recall, Jade and Reptile, those were all sort of secret, talked about, rumored characters that became fully realized. So that was cool that we got Scarlet that way for DLC. Kenshi was a returning 3D era character, and it was important for MK9 to acknowledge the successful 3D era characters that we got, and Kenshi was certainly one of them. For someone who was just introduced, he had a really strong following, so it made sense to bring him back for DLC. And of course, Freddy Krueger was an unexpected but welcome addition to a Mortal Kombat fighting game. He was available on both the PS3 and the Xbox 360, which was a plus, unlike Kratos. And again, these three characters, alongside Rain, who was also brought back as DLC, this sort of set the tone for how Netherealm would start releasing the DLC characters. And again, this didn't just apply to Mortal Kombat, it also carried over to their other fighting game, Injustice. So what were the cons of MK9? Rain was DLC instead of a base character. I still don't understand why he did not make it to the base roster. It's probably just a matter of timing and maybe technology. But one of the things we were robbed of because Rain did not make it to the game on the base roster is we didn't get to see him in story mode. And that was despite him being a classic character. So I almost feel like we were robbed of seeing Rain do something within this timeline. I understand we got him as DLC, but I really believe he should have been on the base roster. It was really disappointing that we didn't get any extra DLC. Again, for a new game, new generation, new players, this was their chance to really start pumping out these characters to this new generation of players. And unfortunately, we just got 4. And my final con is that we only got 2 3D era characters, which is Quan Chi and Kenshi. To me, again, if you know this channel, I totally biased to the 3D characters. And this is simply unacceptable to me. Although I understand the need to focus on the characters that define the franchise, but it really should not come at the expense of an entire generation of characters that kept the Mortal Kombat brand alive during the 3D and PS2 era. So yes, let's focus on those classic characters, but let's not ignore the other great characters that were introduced in the previous generation. So in closing, I just want to reiterate what made MK9's roster special and why I gave it an 8, which is still a good score. Again, it was overall faithful to the characters who were the most recognizable and who built the franchise's history. And I also want to know, I think it was a deliberate choice to avoid many of the new characters that were introduced in the 3D era or the PS2 generation. While a handful of them, like the Kenshis, like the Boraichos, like Frost, were appealing and cool and fun, I acknowledge the majority of them were not. But in my opinion, let's take the characters that sort of have a good foundation to work with, and let's bring them back to the game. And that's it from my opinion of the MK9 roster. My next video will be about the MKX roster, which I'm excited to get into and to dissect. So what rating would you assign MK9's roster? Tell me about it in the comments down below. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and share this video. Also be sure to follow me on all platforms. The links will be in the description. I thank you so much for tuning in. I am CarbonClyve, and I will see you later.